Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are really tackling a big one. We're charting the course of psychosocial development in adolescence.
It's that decade, isn't it? That critical time where you're trying to answer that massive question, who am I?
Exactly. And everything feeds into it, every success, every, first love, every failure. It's all raw material for that answer.
Right. And this isn't just about passive growth. Our source material frames it as an active self-construction. We're starting with Erikson's foundational work, which is the classic roadmap.
But it gets updated, right? Because the landscape has completely changed.
Oh, completely. The sources immediately bring in modern pressures, the constant scrutiny of social media, the fact that adulthood is economically delayed, these huge shifts in gender and sexual identity. It's a whole new ballgame.
Okay, so let's set our mission for this deep dive.
There.
We're going to try and extract those core concepts of identity formation, that mix of roles, beliefs, aspirations that sort of becomes your inner compass.
And then map it against the external forces?
Yes. The family dynamics, the push and pull with peers, and then we have to get into the tougher stuff, the internal and external challenges, like depression statistics and the neuroscience behind why teens take the risks they do.
I think what's so fascinating is how the sources define the end goal. They describe identity as a consistent definition of oneself as a unique individual.
Consistent, that's the key word.
It is. It's about building a coherent narrative of yourself, one that holds up over time. And we're going to explore how that consistency is fought for, how it's achieved, or, as is often the case today, how it gets put on hold.
A very long hold sometimes. So we'll start with the classic theories, the structure, and then pivot right into the surprisingly fluid and often very challenging nature of finding yourself in the 21st century.
When you want to define this stage of life, you really have to start with Erikson. All roads lead back to his framework.
Right.
He designated the adolescent years, so roughly ages 12 to 18, as the fifth stage of psychosocial development.
And his fifth stage gives us the core conflict, the one that defines everything, identity versus role confusion.
Exactly.
The whole period is just this internal wrestling match. You're trying to figure out, who am I? But at the same time, you're just overwhelmed by all the different people you could be.
You feel pulled in a dozen different directions at once. And
Yeah.
if you can navigate that, if you can wrestle all those possibilities into something coherent, you reach what Erikson called identity achievement.
Which is that milestone moment. It's not just knowing who you are, but what else?
It's understanding that who you are is aligned with your past experiences and with your future plans. It's a unification of the self. There's a sense of purpose that comes with it.
But almost nobody gets there in a straight line. It's messy.
Oh, it's incredibly messy. Most young people spend a lot of time in these not yet achieved states. Which brings us to James Marcia's work.
Okay, so how does he build on Erikson?
Marcia took Erikson's ideas and made them measurable. He categorized these identity statuses based on two things. Have you engaged in exploration, and have you made a commitment?
So exploring your options and then actually choosing one.
Precisely. And based on that, he gives us these other identity statuses. We should probably dig into those, starting with role confusion, which is also called identity diffusion.
Okay, so in Marcia's terms, what does that mean?
It means you're low on both axes, you haven't explored any real options, and you haven't made any commitment. It's defined by a lack of concern, almost an apathy. The adolescent didn't seem to know or even care what their identity is.
And what does that look like in real life? We're talking about someone who's just drifting.
Exactly. Drifting is the perfect word. Their attitudes change depending on who they're with. They're not engaged with school, no real thought about the future. They might jump from one hobby to another, one part-time job to another with no real engagement. It's psychological aimlessness.
Okay, so that's role confusion. What's the next state?
The complete opposite, in a way, foreclosure.
Foreclosure. That sounds premature.
It is. It's premature identity formation. Here, the commitment is really high, but the exploration is low or totally non-existent.
How does that happen?
It's when an adolescent adopts roles and values wholesale from their parents or their community or society without ever really questioning them or analyzing them for themselves.
That feels incredibly relevant today. You think about these high-pressure family legacies, you're going to be a doctor just like your father.
Right.
Or the expectation to take over the family business.
Yes, or adhering to very strict religious rules without question.
Yeah.
The identity feels stable on the surface, but it's borrowed. It's fragile because you skipped the hard internal work of making it your own.
So what's the risk there? If it seems stable, what's the problem?
The hidden cost is that if that borrowed identity fails, say the career path collapses or they have a crisis of faith, They have no backup. They have no other explored options to fall back on. They didn't earn that identity, so they don't know how to build a new one.
Wow. Okay, so we have confusion on one end and this sort of borrowed identity on the other. What's in the middle?
In the middle is the state that I think defines modern adolescence for many people, the moratorium.
The moratorium. So this is someone who is actively exploring.
Yes, exploration is high, but commitment is still low. A moratorium is a socially acceptable way to postpone making those big identity-defining decisions.
And the sources give a classic example of this, right?
They do. The number one example of an institutionalized moratorium is going to college.
Of course. It's 4 years where your main job is to figure things out.
Exactly. But the sources point out a modern complication. This period is getting longer and longer. People are delaying commitment to careers, to marriage, to having kids, well into their mid-20s, even later. This moratorium is stretching out.
Which raises a really important question. Is that a good thing? Does all this extra time for exploration lead to a stronger, better identity in the end?
The research is complicated on that. On one hand, exploration is vital. You need it for true achievement. But a moratorium that goes on for too long can become paralyzing.
It becomes commitment anxiety.
That's the term. The very act of choosing one path feels terrifying because it means closing the door on all the others you've been exploring for so long.
So to sum it up, you have these 4 pathways from Erikson and Marcia. Diffusion is no exploration, no commitment.
Right.
Foreclosure is commitment, but without any exploration.
Yep, the borrowed identity.
Moratorium is exploration, but no commitment yet.
The extended timeout.
And finally, achievement, which is when you've explored your options and then made an informed commitment.
That's the full journey. But the modern experience, it seems, is really leaning heavily on that moratorium, on that delay.
Okay, so now that we know how identity is formed, this is where it gets really interesting, because we need to talk about what is being formed. It's not one single thing, is it?
Not at all. Identity is multifaceted. It breaks down into these key dimensions that adolescents have to juggle all at once.
So this internal work is happening across, what, different spheres of life?
Exactly. The sources focus on 4 big ones: religious, political, ethnic, and gender identity.
Let's start with religious identity. What do the sources say about that?
For most teens, especially early on, they tend to accept the broad outlines of their family's religious identity. It's often a passive inheritance. It provides continuity, a sense of belonging.
But that doesn't mean they don't question it.
Not at all. This is when abstract thought really kicks in, what Piaget called formal operational thought. So while they might stick with the general framework, they can start to rigorously question specific beliefs, moral rules, or theological ideas. The exploration happens within the box at first.
Okay, moving on to political identity. The data here shows a really fascinating trend, especially in the U.S.
It does. More adolescents today identify as independent than as Democrat or Republican. It's like their search for a unique identity extends to politics. They don't want a pre-packaged partisan label.
That makes sense. And they also tend to be more liberal than their parents.
Generally, yes, which might reflect that psychological need to differentiate themselves from their parents' generation. But the sources add a really important caution here.
What's that?
That the political identities that really stick, the ones that last into middle age, usually form later in life.
Oh, when you start paying taxes and owning a home.
Exactly, when the political becomes very personal and economic. But one thing is consistent. Regardless of their politics, most adolescents identify very strongly with their ethnicity.
Which is a perfect transition to ethnic identity. This is a huge piece of the puzzle, especially in diverse countries like the U.S. and Canada.
It's massive. About half of all adolescents in those countries have African, Asian, Latinx, or Native American heritage. So this is not a minority experience. It's central to the adolescent journey for millions.
And the sources say it's especially difficult for certain groups.
It is. The work is most intense for adolescents who are, say, multiracial or first-generation immigrants, or those adopted by parents of a different ethnic background.
Because they're trying to integrate multiple narratives at once.
Precisely. They have to synthesize 2 or more distinct cultural stories into one coherent sense of self. It's incredibly complex work.
But when they do that work, the payoff is huge. The sources say pride in your ethnic identity correlates with better academic achievement, better overall well-being.
It does, but they're careful to say the relationship is complex and nuanced. It's not a simple A plus B equals C equation.
So what's the nuance?
The idea is that a strong, positive ethnic identity acts as a protective buffer. It gives you a sense of belonging and pride that helps you withstand external challenges like, systemic discrimination or daily microaggressions.
So the strong internal story helps you fight the negative external ones.
That's a great way to put it. The cohesion of that identity builds resilience.
Okay, and the final dimension is one that has just completely transformed since Erikson's time. Gender identity.
Absolutely. We have to throw out Erikson's old concept of gender intensification.
Where teens just exaggerated traditional male and female roles.
Right. That framework just doesn't fit what we see today at all. The modern focus is squarely on gender identity, your internal personal sense of being male, female, transgender, non-binary, or something else.
So the journey often starts with your biological sex, and then that leads toward adopting a gender role, which is what? The social expectations.
Yes, the behaviors and attitudes that society deems appropriate for that gender. But the key here is that so many adolescents are questioning some, or even all, of those traditional roles they're exploring.
And we can see Marcia's identity status is playing out here too.
You can. Some adolescents show foreclosure by exaggerating stereotyped gender roles, maybe to fit in or to avoid the confusion that comes with questioning. It's a way of grabbing onto a fixed, easy answer.
And others might go into a moratorium.
Definitely. They might postpone dating or avoid sexual contact altogether. It's not about being asexual necessarily. It's about giving themselves the space to figure out their gender and sexual identity without the pressure of a relationship.
To really talk about this, we have to use the modern language that the sources provide. We can start with the traditional idea of the gender binary.
Right, the idea that there are only two options, male and female.
But adolescent exploration today goes way beyond that.
It does. So we have the term transgender for someone whose gender identity is different from the sex they were assigned at birth, and the term cisgender for people whose gender identity does align with their natal sex.
And then there's the big umbrella term that captures this whole spectrum of identity.
LGBTQIA plus SECA, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual. And the plus is so important because it acknowledges all the other nuanced identities that exist. Understanding this openness, this fluidity of definition is absolutely central to understanding the modern adolescent.
Okay, so once that internal identity work starts happening, the adolescent has to test it out in the real world, and that starts at home. Let's talk about family dynamics.
And the first thing the sources make clear is that conflict is normal. It's not a sign that the family is failing.
Right. All close relationships have conflict, especially when one person is fighting for autonomy.
That's the core tension. And the job of the caregiver, the parent, is to walk this incredibly fine line. You can't be too strict because that just invites rebellion.
But you can't be too lenient either because that can feel like you don't care.
Exactly. The research is very clear on this. The goal is to maintain support while increasing autonomy. It's a constant balancing act.
And to maintain that closeness, which is the big protective factor, the sources lay out 4 specific ingredients.
They do. First is communication, open, honest dialogue. Second is support, knowing your family has your back. Third is connectedness, that sense of being a team. And fourth is a word that can be misunderstood. Control.
Yeah, let's push on that. Control sounds negative. It sounds like dominance.
It does, but in this context, it means something very different. It's defined as parental monitoring.
Okay, what is that?
It's the parents' ongoing, warm, and informed awareness of what their kids are doing, where they are, and who they're with. It's not about spying, it's about being invested. Good monitoring communicates that you care.
It's supportive awareness, not mistrustful surveillance.
That's the perfect way to phrase it.
And these dynamics look very different depending on the culture.
Hugely different. Parent-child conflict is much less common in cultures that emphasize familism.
And familism is what? The idea that the family unit comes first.
Yes. It's the belief that family members should sacrifice their personal freedom and individual goals for the good of the family as a whole. The collective identity is more important than individual rebellion.
So how does that play out behaviorally?
In a lot of traditional cultures, teens just won't tell their parents about things they know would cause disapproval. They avoid the conflict to preserve harmony.
Which is so different from what you sometimes see in, say, the U.S., where some teenagers seem to deliberately provoke arguments.
Right. It's not just about testing limits. For them, the argument itself is a negotiation. They're demanding to be recognized as an individual, as an adult.
Okay, so moving out from the family, peers become, well, everything. They are the guides, the mirrors.
They are absolutely essential, and most people immediately think of peer pressure, that push to conform in how you dress, act, talk.
But the sources say it's more of a two-way street than that. They talk about two key processes, selection and facilitation.
Yes, and they work together. First comes selection. This is about agency, about choice. Teenagers actively select friends who are already like them, who share their values and interests,
So you choose friends who validate who you already are.
or who you're trying to become. The sources argue selection is often the primary force. You're not a passive victim of peer pressure, you're an active architect of your peer group.
Okay, so that's selection. Then what's facilitation?
Facilitation is what happens next. Your peers make it easier to do the things you already wanted to do, both good and bad.
So if I want to study for a test, my studious friends facilitate that. If I want to skip class.
Your friends who also want to skip class facilitate that. They provide the social support and the logistical help. They turn the dial up on the behavior you already selected.
And when that dial gets turned in a negative direction, that's when you get into some dark territory.
Yes, that's what the sources call deviancy training. It's destructive peer support, where one person is actively teaching another how to rebel, how to break rules. They reinforce the bad choices and make them socially rewarding within that little group.
As teens are navigating this whole peer world, they also start moving toward romance. And there's a pretty clear sequence for how that happens.
A very specific choreography, yes.
Yeah.
It's a 4-step process. Step 1, you hang out in groups of friends that are all one gender.
Okay.
Step 2, there's a loose association of girls' groups and boys' groups, but the interactions are very public in a big crowd. Think school dances, football games.
Very low stakes.
Yeah.
Then step 3.
Things get a bit more serious. Small, mixed-sex groups form, usually made up of the most socially confident kids from the bigger crowd.
And finally, that leads to step 4.
The formation of actual couples with private intimacies away from the group.
And what does the research say about these first loves?
That they typically show up in high school and they rarely last more than a year. It's also interesting that girls report having a steady partner more often than boys do at this age.
But even though they're short, the emotional weight is huge.
Massive. The sources have a serious warning here. Breakups, unreciprocated crushes, they are devastating for adolescents. The rejection feels like a judgment on their entire self, the very self they're trying so hard to build. And sometimes that pain can lead to thoughts of revenge or even suicide.
It's so intense. And part of this exploration involves a sexual orientation, who you're attracted to.
Right. And the sources make a crucial point here. For many teens, their orientation and desires are surprisingly fluid. It's not a fixed point for everyone. It's a period of genuine questioning and discovery.
And the culture you're in has a huge impact on that discovery.
A massive impact. In places like North America and Western Europe, the cultural shifts mean that diverse gender roles and sexual orientations are much more visible and accepted now. That gives questioning teens positive reference points, which is so important.
Navigating all this also means navigating sexual health. And the education teens get is a real mixed bag. It comes from everywhere.
And the sources are often contradictory. Source number 1, the most dominant one, is the media.
Right.
And there's a clear correlation. The more sexualized media a teen consumes, the earlier they tend to initiate sexual activity. The media often shows the excitement without any of the consequences.
Okay, source 2.
Parents. This is often the weakest link in the chain. Many parents wait too long, they're vague, they're uncomfortable, or they're just not informed about what's really going on.
But the research is clear on what works, right?
It is. Warm, open communication from parents is the single most effective form of sex education.
Okay, source 3. Peers.
Their influence is incredibly powerful, especially if parents are silent or just say, don't do it. What you learn depends entirely on your friend group. Some cliques are all virgins. In others, everyone is sexually active.
And there's an alarming statistic in here.
There is. Only about half of sexually active teen couples in the U.S. accurately discuss things like preventing pregnancy or STIs. The communication just isn't happening.
And the final source. Educators. So school-based sex ed.
Right. And most parents in the U.S. actually want good, comprehensive sex ed in schools. But what's taught varies wildly from state to state, but there's one definitive research finding.
Let me guess. Abstinence-only programs were not successful.
Not successful at all. It's counterintuitive to some, but the data is very clear.
So why don't they work? What's the psychology there?
There are a couple of reasons. First, for an adolescent who is trying to establish autonomy, simply forbidding something can make it seem more attractive, an easy way to rebel. And second, and maybe more importantly, Those programs fail to provide life-saving information about contraception and STI prevention. So the teens who were going to be sexually active anyway, and there are always some, were left completely unprepared and unsafe.
They failed on both the behavioral and the practical informational levels.
Precisely.
And we have to just briefly mention the huge role of technology in all of this. It mediates everything now.
It does, and the sources flag 4 major areas of concern. Gender inequity, which often shows up as online abuse, sexual abuse, like the non-consensual sharing of images, cyberbullying, which is relentless because you can't escape it, and something called relationship stopping.
What's that?
It's breaking up via text or just ghosting someone. It minimizes the emotional weight and teaches poor communication skills for real-world relationships. So when this whole process, the identity search, the relationship drama becomes too much, the stress has to go somewhere, and it either goes inward or outward.
Let's start with the internalizing challenges. We're talking about sadness, depression, and suicide.
Yes. And we know self-esteem generally takes a hit around puberty. Periods of sadness are pretty common. The things that help you bounce back are strong family and peer support.
And culture plays a role too, right? Like familism.
Well, exactly. Having that built-in sense of belonging can be a huge protective factor. But sometimes normal sadness deepens into major depressive disorder.
Which is more than just feeling down. It's that persistent hopelessness, lethargy, feeling worthless for weeks or months on end.
Right. And the causes are complex genes, stress, biology. But the sources highlight one specific behavior that can make it so much worse: rumination with peers.
Explain that.
Yeah.
Because we think of talking to friends as being helpful. How does it become a trap?
It's the difference between venting to solve a problem and just spiraling together. Rumination is when you co-dwell on negative thoughts. Instead of helping each other find solutions or distractions, you just amplify the misery.
You get stuck in a negative feedback loop.
Yes. The peer group becomes an echo chamber of negativity instead of a source of support.
And when we talk about the most severe outcomes here, we need to be really precise with the language. The first step is suicidal ideation.
Which is thinking about suicide. It can range from a fleeting thought to making a detailed plan.
Then there's parasuicide.
And this is a really important distinction. Parasuicide is any action against the self that could be lethal but doesn't result in death. It's often a desperate cry for help. And the sources stress that parasuicide is actually quite common, whereas completed suicide is much more rare.
And then there's the tragic phenomenon of cluster suicides.
Right. When several suicides happen in a group or community in a short period, it's often fueled by a kind of emotional contagion, which can be amplified by social media.
The statistics on ideation are pretty stark, especially the gender difference.
They are. About 24% of girls, nearly a quarter, seriously considered suicide, compared to 13% of boys. Now, boys complete suicide at higher rates because they tend to use more lethal means, but girls experience ideation and parasuicide much more frequently.
Okay, now let's pivot to the externalizing challenges. Delinquency and defiance. The sources make a really interesting connection here.
They do. They say that in adolescence, internalizing and externalizing behaviors are more closely linked than at any other time in life. So the same underlying stress that might cause one person to withdraw into depression could cause another to act out aggressively.
When it comes to breaking the law, most teens actually do it at some point.
Yes. Self-report studies show most kids have done something: shoplifting, vandalism, truancy by age 20. But who actually gets into trouble with the system is a very different story.
The data is really clear on this.
It is. The adolescents who are more likely to be arrested are disproportionately male, from an ethnic minority, or from a low socioeconomic family. This points to systemic biases in policing and enforcement, not necessarily differences in the rate of minor lawbreaking.
So while increased anger is normal during puberty, most teens find acceptable ways to deal with it, but some don't. And the sources define 2 very different types of offenders.
Right. First, you have the life course persistent offender. This is a rare but serious case. Their criminal activity starts early, often with behavioral problems in childhood, and it just continues throughout their life. This is the career criminal.
And the other type.
The much more common type is the adolescence limited offender. Their criminal activity starts later, in the teen years, and importantly, it stops by about age 21.
So this is the kid who's just messing up, experimenting, but eventually matures out of it.
Exactly. They get into some trouble, but as they achieve adult roles, get a job, form a serious relationship, the criminal behavior fades away.
And the research actually identifies 3 pathways that can be early warning signs for the more serious, life course persistent track.
Yes, and they show a scary escalation. Pathway 1 starts with just being stubborn in childhood, which escalates to defiance of authority.
Pathway 2 is about property. It starts with minor stuff like shoplifting, and then can escalate to serious crimes like arson or burglary.
And pathway 3 is the most concerning. It starts with interpersonal aggression, like bullying, and if it's not stopped, it can escalate to the most serious violence: assault, rape, and even murder.
It's sobering to see how those early behaviors can predict such severe outcomes. On a more positive note, though, overall adolescent crime has been going down.
It has. And the sources offer a few possible reasons. Things like fewer high school dropouts, maybe wiser judges using therapy instead of just punishment, smaller families, better access to contraception, a whole range of social factors.
Okay, let's move to the other major externalizing behavior, drug use and abuse. There's a very clear timeline for this.
Very clear. Use starts to become widespread around age 10. It peaks between 18 and 25, and then it generally goes down.
Which makes the early use statistics really important.
They're critical. The sources say that drug use before age 15 is the single best predictor of later abuse and dependency. The earlier you start, the bigger the risk.
And use has changed over time, right, with different generations.
It has. These are called cohort differences. For some of the classic drugs like cigarettes or synthetic narcotics, use in the U.S. is actually way down from where it was in the 1970s.
But that's been replaced by something new?
It has. There's been a massive, rapid increase in vaping. And what's interesting is how risk perception plays into this. It's not so much about whether a drug is available, it's about how dangerous teens think it is.
And there are gender differences here, too.
Yes. Adolescent boys generally use more drugs and more often than girls. And the sources suggest this is often reinforced by social pressure, that old idea of, if I don't drink or smoke, I'm not a real man.
Let's spend some real time on the specific harms, because the science here is stark. Let's start with tobacco.
In an adolescent, tobacco physically slows down growth. It messes with digestion and appetite, leading to protein and vitamin deficiencies right when your body needs them most.
And it's not just growth, it's about developmental damage.
Irreparable damage, yes, to the developing heart, lungs, brain, and reproductive systems. You're not just damaging a fully formed organ, you're interfering with its construction.
Okay, what about alcohol?
It's the most frequently abused drug by teenagers in North America, and the harm is primarily neurological. It can permanently damage memory and self-control.
How? By damaging specific parts of the brain.
Exactly. 2 key areas: the hippocampus, which is vital for forming new memories, and the prefrontal cortex.
And the prefrontal cortex is the brain's CEO. Judgment, impulse control, planning.
All of it. And what's so devastating is that the prefrontal cortex is the very last part of the brain to finish maturing. It's not done until your mid-20s. So heavy drinking during adolescence is like flooding a construction site. You're damaging the very systems you need for adult decision-making.
And it also creates a nasty psychological cycle.
A vicious one. Alcohol lets you momentarily deny your problems, but the problems don't go away, they get worse. So then you need more alcohol to get the same level of denial, and that's how dependency starts.
And finally, marijuana.
The data shows that adolescents who use it regularly are much more likely to drop out of school, become teen parents, and be unemployed later. Cognitively, it can impact memory, language skills, and motivation.
So given all these risks, what actually works to prevent drug abuse? The sources point out some things that surprisingly don't work.
Yes, and this is so important. First, some of the old-school anti-drug classes might have actually increased drug use.
Wait, how is that possible?
For a few reasons. One, the ads sometimes made the drugs look exciting, part of a rebellious lifestyle. 2, the warnings were often so exaggerated that teens knew they weren't true, so they stopped trusting any of the information. And 3, it just gave some kids ideas for new ways to defy authority.
Wow, and there's another counterintuitive failure.
Yes, anti-smoking ads produced by the tobacco companies themselves sometimes increased use. Maybe because teens saw them as insincere or just normalized the brand.
So what does work?
Big, massive, fact-based ad campaigns have been very successful. The ones in Florida and California, for example, cut teen smoking by nearly 50%. They were relentless and focused on real-world harm, not scare tactics.
They also talk about fighting something called generational forgetting.
I love that term. It's the idea that each new generation forgets what the last one learned about the dangers of drugs. You have to constantly re-educate people about the current risks, like with vaping, to refresh that perception of harm.
And in the end, it's a combination of things.
It's never just one thing. It's positive parental role models, changing the social context so sobriety is seen as normal, and then the practical stuff. Higher prices, targeted warnings, and better law enforcement. It has to be a full court press.
What an incredible journey. We started by mapping that fundamental quest for identity, looking at the quick commitment of foreclosure versus that long necessary delay of the moratorium. And we look at the huge role of family in that double-edged sword of peer facilitation.
Right.
And finally, we dove into how teens cope when it's all too much, the internalizing path of depression and neurological risk, and the externalizing path of delinquency and substance abuse.
And if you tie it all together, what you see is this profound tension that defines the entire period. You have this deep internal drive to define yourself, to create a consistent identity.
But it's pushing against a modern world that almost forces you to delay commitment, to stay fluid.
Exactly. The self is simultaneously demanded and delayed. It makes resilience not just a nice trait to have, but an absolute necessity for survival.
Which really brings up a final important question for you, the listener, to think about. Given that our society has basically turned the moratorium, that acceptable postponement of identity, into the default stage of development for so many, what does that do in the long run? How does that extended delay ultimately impact the identity that a person finally lands on in young adulthood?
Does all that extra time lead to a stronger, more authentic self? Or does it just create a prolonged state of uncertainty and anxiety about ever making a choice?
Think about that tension between all that choice and all that delay and what it really means to be navigating the maze of identity today. Thank you for diving deep with us.